Chapter 3. The next morning presented a world washed clean, if somewhat battered by the storm. When they all went to the stables to get their horses after breaking the night's fast with the inn's usual excellent fare, the contrast between the clear, calmly bright morning was in marked and welcome contrast to the weather of the previous 2 days. Though it was still cold, the air had lost the frigid quality that had previously numbed their extremities and seared their lungs. Instead, it felt fresh and bracing. The crisp air was pleasantly scented with the fragrance of the low-growing rosemary that still grew in profusion here in the gently rolling foothills of the northern Bagnor Mountains. When they led their saddled horses out of the stables, the demeanour of the horses mirrored their own sense of relief. They looked rested and energetic, and delighted to be outside the confines of the stables. Racer welcomed Dane with exuberant good spirits and great delight, despite having been neglected, as Anmar put it. Leonard had been concerned about Nightwind and Racer's response to Zand. He needn't have worried. So successful was Zand in his efforts to reassure the two strange horses that Racer even briefly touched noses with him after Shadow had done so in her usual fashion. The more reserved Nightwind kept her distance, though she too did not seem perturbed. As they all stowed their gear on their respective horses, Leonard noticed that Anmar and Dane also travelled very light. Everybody looked neat and trim in newly cleaned and pressed clothes. Leonard had decided not to wear his uniform, though he had been particularly pleased with the way it had been cleaned, as he knew from experience it was not easy to do. The first part of their journey took them through the heart of the silk-producing region. They left the Great Royal Road about half a day out from Rickle for a less frequented secondary road that would lead them onto the lower plains plateau. The going was easy, as the road wended its well-kept way through the low-lying and temperate rolling Rickle plains. Originally all grassland, vast stretches were now occupied by parsec upon parsec of lenda trees. The serried ranks of the compact trees had the usual ragged look that they always assumed towards the end of the Rickle caterpillar's voracious growing season, as they ate their way through the vast quantities of leaves that they devoured during this cycle of their lives. The heavily furred caterpillars were now so big that their fat silvery shapes were clearly visible amongst the dark green foliage. Some trees already bore some of the large golden oblong-shaped cocoons that the mature caterpillars spun. In another 2 moons, when the warmer weather of pre-summer triggered their appearance, the trees would be teeming with the large rust-red Rickle moths, laying eggs for the next generation. Hundreds of workers would also be swarming in and around the trees, harvesting the cocoons to be processed so that the spinners could start their part in the production of the silk that the region was so famous for. Anmar teased Dane about his indulgence in the extravagance of pure silk underwear, despite its high cost. He replied airily that his delicate skin required nothing less. Leonard set a brisk pace that he knew the tireless Shadow could maintain for the whole day. He kept a close eye on the other 2 horses, and was relieved to see that they kept up quite easily with the big mare. At their side, and slightly to the front, the Lound settled into the effortless lope that he could keep up virtually indefinitely. Leonard knew from experience that the Lound would outlast the horses at this pace. They stopped only twice during the day at wayside rest stops, so that the horses could drink and graze for a few minutes. Leonard, Anmar, and Dane also used these opportunities to eat and drink something and stretch cramped muscles. At these stops, Leonard also gave each of the horses a small piece of fortified feed cake that he always carried for its highly nutritive and energy-producing qualities. The self-sufficient Zand disappeared briefly at one of these stops and reappeared a while later, still licking his muzzle. For the whole of the first 3 days out of Rickle, they travelled through the verdant lender groves as the road wound its way through them. The close-growing trees sheltered them from the wind, and it became almost warm as the paved surface of the well-kept road reflected the warmth of the sun. Only in the infrequent breaks in the trees were they conscious of a sharper chill in the wind. They passed the first 2 nights in simple but pleasant hostelries, where the hospitable valleys of the region were much in evidence. Zand was on his best behaviour. He muted his telepathic abilities completely, and consequently caused less comment than usual. Their horses were cared for more than adequately in the well-equipped stables at each establishment. The 3rd morning of their journey to Gordofane marked a change in their surroundings, as they left the cultivated and densely populated silk-producing region behind them and started the gradual ascent that would take them up onto the lower plains plateau. They now had a 4th horse, a sure-footed hill pony, following on a lead rein behind Shadow. The sturdy little mare was loaded with some basic supplies, as they had been warned at the last inn that the way stations on the plateaus were not always well supplied. They were also advised to use those supplies sparingly in case they became snowbound, as sometimes happened, especially as they reached the upper plateau. As the morning wore on, the track started climbing more and more steeply, and the linder groves fell away far behind them. There was now an ever more distinct chill in the wind that started blowing more strongly as they ascended the escarpment to the lower plains plateau. The quality of the road also deteriorated somewhat as the day wore on, and they rose ever higher towards the plateau. As they crested the last short but very steep rise in the late afternoon and rode out onto the plateau, the bite of the wind was immediately much more apparent. They all raised the hoods of their cloaks. Anmar wound her long scarf round and round her neck and tucked the ends into the front of the padded jacket she had put on earlier in the afternoon. Lhounds drew the voluminous folds of his cloak over the front of his body so that his legs were covered as well. Dane exclaimed in dismay and hurriedly fished thick sheep's-wool gloves out of his saddlebag. Despite their tiredness after the steep climb, the horses involuntarily quickened their pace to generate more body heat. Zand was the only one who seemed unaffected by the sudden drop in temperature. The terrain around them also changed its character abruptly. It was suddenly a flat and bare and stony landscape, with only some tough-looking tussocky grass in sheltered pockets, and some stunted shrubs that grew close to the ground. The road was generally straight with a fairly good surface, just occasionally winding its way around infrequent rocky outcrops and clusters of weather-worn boulders that sparsely dotted the area. It was obvious that the entire landscape was continually at the mercy of the scouring wind. As dusk started creeping over the desolate landscape, Lhounds gently spurred Shadow on. "Let's try and speed up a little," he called over his shoulder. "We must get to a way station. I do not want to be caught out here in the open at night without shelter." The big mare obediently increased her pace, and the other horses followed suit. As dusk fell rapidly, Lhounds told Zand, "Lead, please, Zand." And the big animal immediately settled into a smooth, flowing run that took him slightly ahead of the group, and then kept him there with seemingly little effort. Not for the first time, Lhounds thought that it was only when Zand was running like this, with the wind of his passage smoothing out the luxuriant mane, and the lengths of the legs emphasized by the long strides he took, that his relationship to his Etabrian hunting hound forebears was most evident. As time passed and the early dark of night settled around them, Lhounds knew that Shadow would be following the tawny shape of the Lound with complete faith that he would keep them safely on the by now almost invisible road. The little group sped through the early night with only the drumming sound of hooves, the snorting breathing of the horses, and the keening of the wind for company. Lhounds was just becoming uncomfortably aware that the breathing of the three horses was getting progressively more laboured, when a faint light flickered ahead of them as they entered a fairly straight section of road. With relief, Lhounds sent, "We can slow a bit," including the two other humans in the sending. As the group slowed to a canter, the light ahead grew slowly brighter. A few minutes later, they reached the way station. As they rode through the gateway in the sturdy bamboo and wood-clad walls, Lhounds was disappointed to see that it was one of the very basic ones. It was no more than a sizable, partially roofed enclosure, with the single gate that they had entered by, that could be closed for safety. The only light was provided by a lantern over the gateway, and two more inside, hanging on the wooden walls of the enclosure. In one corner was a small hut, dim light visible through a small, dirty window. The other corner contained what looked like a small shed or lean-to in the dim light. They dismounted rather stiffly. It had been a very long day in the saddle. As Lhounds walked towards the hut, he spoke over his shoulder. "Close the gate, please, Dane. We don't want to be visited tonight by any hungry plateau she-wolves." Zand uttered a low growl of agreement. Dane complied with alacrity. The rasping of the bolts had a comforting sound as Dane slid them home. Zand immediately melted into the darkness. Lhounds knew he would be investigating the enclosure and keeping watch. It had also proved advantageous in the past on various occasions to not make it apparent from the outset that he was accompanied by a Lound. Lhounds had to knock twice before the door of the bamboo hut opened, and a stooped figure stood in the doorway. "Yes?" a surly voice queried. "We need food and shelter for the night, for ourselves and our animals," Lhounds replied briefly. The man's offhand manner was infecting him. The attendant collected another lantern from inside the hut and led them in under the roofed section of the enclosure. In the light of the lantern, they saw that the area was equipped with several long benches, a large table, a rudimentary fireplace in the middle of the earthen floor, and several rickety-seeming beds with bare, grubby-looking mattresses. The man put the lantern down on a shelf that also contained a few plates and cooking utensils. He pointed at a large stack of corded wood in one corner. When he spoke, it was with a marked lack of enthusiasm. "Help yourself to firewood. It costs 2 centimes per bundle. The only food I can let you have is some roasted meal cakes. You can draw water from the well next to my hut. Hay for the horses is under that cover over there, 1 centime per bale. Ablution facilities in the shed." The man gestured towards the lean-to. He peered at them for a moment before turning away. Anmar spoke with what Lhounds regarded as admirable restraint. "Just a moment, please. We also need horse blankets, and blankets for ourselves." The man looked at her with the same disinterest he had displayed before. Then he waved vaguely at what looked like 2 large piles of rags at one end of the shelf that he'd put the lantern on. "Help yourselves." He turned away and started shuffling off in the direction of his hut. After a few steps, he stopped. "Do you want some meal cakes?" It was clear from his tone of voice that the matter was of no interest to him. Lhounds forced himself to answer civilly that they would. The attendant returned after a few moments with a few large meal cakes. Lhounds was relieved to see that they were still securely sealed in the manufacturer's woven bamboo leaf wrappings. After the attendant had disappeared into his hut and shut the door with an unmistakable air of finality, the humans looked at each other. The contrast between the warm and pleasant inn where they had spent the previous night and their current circumstances was stark. Despite the enclosure and the roof over the section where they found themselves, it was still bitterly cold. The impact of the wind was less severe inside the shelter, but had by no means been eliminated completely. After a few moments, during which they all looked at each other in their surroundings with no small measure of dismay, Anmar spoke with a brave attempt at cheerful briskness. "A fire first, I think, and then the horses." Lhounds nodded, then strode to the corner and got 2 large bundles of wood. He dropped them next to the fireplace. As he bent to cut the cords, Anmar spoke again. "Let Dane make the fire. He's a wizard at it. I think we should see to the horses. They must be exhausted and hungry." The horses were indeed standing with their heads low. Nightwind in particular seemed very tired. They led the horses to the troughs that had been fastened to the wall. While Lhounds filled one of the troughs with water from the well, Anmar got the saddles off the exhausted animals. All 3 horses rippled their coats gratefully, then started drinking greedily. Lhounds filled the other 2 troughs with hay. As the horses started feeding, he and Anmar rubbed them down with handfuls of straw. Then they covered them with the warmest blankets that they could find in the unpromising collection that the attendant had pointed out to them. Behind them, Dane already had a vigorous fire going. The faint warmth was immediately welcome. As Anmar and Lhounds joined him and stretched out chilled hands towards the fire, Dane grumbled. "Most of the heat from this fire is being lost outwards." He had already filled a large blackened kettle with water and put it over the grid on the fireplace. Lhounds looked around speculatively. "Maybe we can rig up some sort of a screen. If we upend a few of those bunks, we can hang some of those horse blankets over them." This was soon and easily done. Using the mattresses to block the gaps between them, they stood 4 of the bamboo bed frames in a circle around the fire, then draped horse blankets over them to form a makeshift screen. The effect was immediately apparent, as the heat of the fire was reflected inwards. Though it was hardly warm, the effect of the searing cold was lessened significantly. As the 3 humans gratefully settled on benches between the screen and the fire, Zand spoke in Lhounds' mind. "I go and hunt." Lhounds reluctantly left the fire to open the gate for Zand. "Come straight back if there are wolf packs around," he cautioned as the large shape melted away into the darkness. As he sat down at the fire again, Dane asked hopefully, "Do you think you'll be able to find anything? I'm absolutely famished. Meal cakes are better than nothing, but I never find them very palatable on their own." Lhounds nodded in agreement, then said, "If there is anything to be found, Zand will find it. But I'm uneasy about him alone out there. By himself, not even Zand is a match for a large, ravenous pack of she-wolves." As Lhounds walked back to the fire, Anmar stood up and got a large pot from the shelf. She rinsed it thoroughly with water from the bucket that Lhounds had refilled after giving the horses their drinking water. She half filled the pot with water and put it on the grid next to the kettle that was already starting to steam gently. "We can make some soup," she remarked. "I have some dried vegetables and seasoning in my pack. At least it will be hot and savory, something to go with the meal cakes." Dane immediately looked more cheerful. He stood up and rummaged in his pack. "I think I may still have a few of those large dried grove mushrooms." He soon triumphantly produced a few shriveled-up dark brown objects and held them out to Anmar, who accepted them with a pleased smile. Leonard also dug around in his pack and came to light with a small horn box. "Here's some dried vine tomato powder. It'll help to flavor the soup." Anmar tipped some of their meager ingredients into the pot and stirred the contents with the battered-looking wooden spoon provided. She replaced the lid, then settled on the bench next to her brother. "I didn't realize that it was quite this primitive up here," she said. "Nor did I," Leonard admitted. "I've never been this way before. The only time I've been to Gordofane was years ago, when I was in the escort for King Dinar." He conducted a royal progress to Gordofane, not long after he had taken over the throne. He wanted to establish a visible presence and also pay a courtesy visit to his mother, Queen Iruda, who had settled in Gordofane after she stepped down from the throne. "We travelled along the Great Royal Road, in such easy stages that it was really like a nice long holiday for all of us." Leonard realized that his voice contained more than a hint of nostalgia. "Not much of a holiday this time," he added, while a resigned tone crept into his voice. All three of them were cradling steaming mugs of strong, heavily sweetened herb tea when an urgent "Open!" came from Zand. Leonard reached the gate in a few long strides and swung it open. Zand bounded in with alacrity, a limp form swinging from his mouth. As he carried the large tussock hare over to the roofed part of the enclosure and dropped it just inside, he briefly sent "She-wolves" to Leonard. Leonard was perturbed, but also reassured by the fact that Zand did not seem overly concerned. Amidst many expressions of appreciation to Zand, Dane set about butchering the hare immediately. "This will make a tremendous difference to our soup," he said with satisfaction. Anmar nodded and put out a tentative hand to pat Zand, but then obviously thought better of it. In response to her unspoken impulse, Zand went to her and nosed gently at her hand. Involuntarily, she started stroking the broad head. She was rewarded by a suffusion of warmth in her mind that, for the very first time since Marda's death, assuaged the almost ever-present sense of loss to some extent. Impulsively, she hugged the big head to her. With a lighter heart, she then started cutting up and rinsing the pieces of hare meat that Dane passed her, before dropping them into the pot that was starting to bubble and give off a very savory smell. "I think I'll crumble some meal cake into the soup to thicken it a bit," she said. After their meal, which had been surprisingly good and filling, consisting as it did of the thick, savory, meaty soup and more of the meal cakes, they all settled next to the fire with more steaming herb tea, while Zand dealt with the remaining rabbit bones. Tiredness soon got the better of them, however. Having made sure that the horses were comfortable, Leonard put one of the mattresses on the floor next to his bed for Zand, and then they all went to sleep under thick layers of cloaks and blankets after building up the fire. Leonard woke some time later as a result of an urgent mental push from Zand. As he raised himself on one elbow, he saw Zand standing at the side of his bed. In the faint glow of the last embers, Leonard could see that the big body was rigid with tension. At his muted query, Zand replied, "3 she-wolves outside." At the same time, Leonard heard scratching and snuffling at the bamboo wall next to the horses. Almost simultaneously, the horses woke up and backed away from the wall with snorts and whinnies of alarm. Dane and Anmar also stirred in their beds, then sat up. "What's the matter?" Dane asked groggily. "She-wolves outside," Leonard said tersely. "They're after the horses." Then a peremptory and urgent instruction came from Zand. "Shut your minds. I'm going to try and drive them off." Though Leonard obeyed immediately and slammed up his mental shutters, he still felt a sickening and vertiginous miasma of horror sweep past the fringes of his mind. Dane cried out in shock, and the horses reared wildly. At the same time, frantic yelps and snarls, amid scrabbling sounds, could be heard outside as the she-wolves ran in fear of their lives. For a few moments, after the sounds of their retreat had faded away into the night, the air was still thick with an almost palpable sense of soul-chilling menace. Then it was replaced with a powerful surge of warmth and reassurance, mostly directed at the horses, that started calming down immediately. The humans also felt themselves responding to Zand's calming sending. Anmar reached across and touched Dane's arm. Dane's face still showed almost bone-white in the warm glow from the embers. "Get us a good fire going, won't you, brother?" she asked. While Dane busied himself doing exactly that, and the horses lowered their heads to their troughs in unconcerned feeding, she glanced at Zand, now recumbent on his mattress again, then looked at Lhounds. "It's incredible thinking that this calming warmth is coming from the same mind that nearly frightened those dreadful things outside to death a few moments ago." Lhounds leant down and ran a caressing hand over the broad head. Zand blinked sleepily gleaming eyes at Lhounds, and then also favoured Anmar with a benign look, before lowering his head onto his paws and closing his eyes. It was almost impossible to believe that the horrendous psychic energy that had riven mind-space such a short time before had emanated from the drowsily relaxed creature. Dane had just got a healthy fire going again when their surly attendant came bursting out of his hut with significantly more speed of movement than he had displayed the previous evening. "What was that?" he spluttered. "What happened?" He was positively shaking. Lhounds realized belatedly that the man's unshielded mind must have received much more of the fallout from Zand's sending to the she-wolves than their own. He tried to speak in as calming a tone as possible. "There were some she-wolves outside, and they frightened the horses. We managed to drive them off, so nothing to distress yourself about." As he spoke, Lhounds was conscious of an increase in intensity in the calming sending that Zand was projecting. "Oh, then that is in order. That seems fine." The man's equilibrium and surly demeanour at least partially restored, he turned and shuffled away, then disappeared back into his hut. Lhounds caught an almost soundless mental whisper from Zand.
"Completely forgot about him."
The sending had just the faintest tinge of sheepishness to it. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Twice Lhounds surfaced briefly from sleep to see Zand lying wakeful, head on paws. The next morning dawned clear and slightly less cold than the day before. After an uninspiring morning repast of meal cakes and herb tea, they packed and saddled the horses, while Zand did a sweep outside the enclosure. Everybody was subdued. Zand returned soon and indicated that there didn't seem to be any she-wolves around. After settling with the attendant, they led the rest of horses outside. The slight feeling of malaise induced by the disturbed night and less than ideal accommodations wore off as the day progressed. This was in large part due to the fact that the searing wind of the previous day had abated somewhat, which allowed the meagre warmth of the sun to have some impact. Lhounds set a fast but sustainable pace for the horses, and the parsecs flowed smoothly by under their hooves, as the day wore on with just occasional stops for the horses to drink at the infrequent watering points provided. The tussock grass and the tough, low-growing mountain parsley and scrubby heath plants provided some grazing for the horses. The humans made do with the last of the meal cakes and cold sweet herb tea. As the day wore on, the wind picked up again, with a resultant drop in temperature, so that it was again a very weary group of people and animals that reached the next way station, as the last rays of the waning sun threw long slanted shadows over the road surface and the bleak stony surface of the plateau around them. In many ways the station resembled the previous one, except that it seemed to be better kept, and the attendant was more cheerful. They were also able to buy some frozen elk cutlets for their supper, and it actually boasted a dormitory with a large fireplace, so the night was passed in significantly warmer surroundings. Even the horses had a rudimentary stable to rest in. No she-wolves disturbed their rest that night. This set the pattern for the seemingly interminable time that it took to cross the vast and desolate expanse of the lower plains plateau. Everybody, horses included, became gradually more exhausted as a result of the constant wear of the wind, which resumed in force again towards the end of the fourth day, and the energy-sapping tedium of the sameness of their surroundings and the unchanging tenor of their days. The way stations varied only in the degree of the quality of the facilities on offer and the level of helpfulness of the caretakers. Still, even the most primitive ones offered a welcome respite after the bone-wearying days spent in the saddle, under the relentless assault of the wind that increased in force as they made their gradual way towards the incline that would take them onto the upper plains plateau. After their fourth day on the plateau, the way station started providing an exchange of pack horses, which was very welcome as their original little pack mare was starting to be worn down by taxing day following taxing day. The first concerted assault of the she-wolves came very early on the morning of their 12th day on the plateau. They had left the way station in the misty greyness well before daybreak, as the attendant had warned them that it was a long stretch to the next station, and that they would be lucky to reach it before nightfall that evening. As usual, it was Zand who raised the alarm. He had drawn Lennard's attention to the presence of the she-wolves the previous afternoon already, but without any great degree of perturbation, as they were
a long way off, not many.
This time, in the grey half-light of very early morning, only about 3 parsecs out from the way station, Zand's sending crackled with urgent energy as he flung
"Many she-wolves!"
into all their minds. Even under these conditions, Lennard was impressed by Zand's presence of mind. Of the horses, only Shadow was included in the sending. Though the other 3 horses could not help but sense something, they were shielded from the full force of the mental imperative that Zand broadcast. They were just skirting a particularly large and slightly convex boulder when Zand's warning sliced into their minds. With hindsight, Anmar would be even more amazed at the speed and smoothness with which Lennard and Zand swung into action. Zand's warning and Lennard's first movement seemed virtually instantaneous. Lennard swung Shadow around and dismounted in one smoothly controlled movement, then bodily urged the other 3 horses and their 2 riders towards the rock. "Back!" he commanded urgently. "Right back up against the rock and stay there. Do not move from there. Control the horses. If they bolt, they are dead, and so are you." Anmar had not seen any movement, but suddenly the stun sword was in his hand, and the shimmering copper blade was hissing out of its housing in the stubby hilt, blade extending as it came. With one easy reach of a long arm, the lead rein of the pack horse attached to Shadow's saddle had been cut so that Shadow was unencumbered, and the horse had been swung round again to face the oncoming threat of the she-wolves. At Lennard's curt instruction, Dane gathered the rein of the pack horse into his strong hand in a frantic grip. Again, with hindsight, Anmar would realize that the posture of the big mare had altered subtly. The hindquarters were bunched in a powerful contraction of the muscles, while the hooves of the forelegs rested lightly on the ground. To the left of the horse, Zand stood perfectly still. To her right, Lennard was lightly poised, crackling stun sword in hand. The leading alpha duo of the she-wolves appeared first and soundlessly, like silver wraiths, out of the mist just off the edge of the path directly opposite them. The 2 lead females were very big. The ruffs of silvery hair around the massive necks were huge, indicating that they were both strong, mature, and experienced. Their almost colourless eyes flickered with concentrated intentness between Zand, Lennard, and Shadow, and the humans and horses behind them, while a low, almost subaudible rumbling growl issued from the broad chests. More and more wolves materialized out of the mist around the 2 leaders. In appalled fascination, Anmar counted 11 of the bulky creatures, before it required all of her attention to control the terrified Nightwind. Next to her, Dane was even more taxed with not only Racer to contend with, but the pack horse as well. But even during her frantic efforts to pacify Nightwind, she picked up Lennard's instruction to Zand. "We must take the 2 alphas first." For some moments, the scene was in a curious stasis. The she-wolves positioned in a closely bunched line on the other side of the narrow track, with Zand, Shadow, and Lennard motionless across from them. Then the alpha duo stepped onto the track and advanced with slow and deliberate menace, eyes blazing with focused ferocity, their growls rising to a chilling, whining snarl. On both sides of them, the rest of the pack also moved forward in a solid phalanx. The next few moments passed in a blur of movement so fast that Anmar was never able to reconstruct the sequence of events with any great clarity. From a standing start, Shadow was suddenly airborne, and with her went Lennard, leaping with the horse, left hand gripping the pommel of the saddle, right hand scything the stun sword downwards and sideways, as they leapt right over the advancing she-wolves. At the same time, Shadow chopped down with lethal metal-shod hooves. As the man and the horse landed behind the she-wolves, amid the stench of burned hair and flesh, 4 she-wolves were lying on the track already. These included one of the alphas, skull split entirely in 2 by the downward stroke of the stun sword, another wolf with a shoulder cut to the bone and gushing blood. Another was trying to drag herself forward, spine severed by one of Shadow's hooves, the 4th one motionless with a head pulverized in the same way. And seemingly at the very instant that the man and the horse leapt, Zand moved in amongst the rest of the she-wolves. The other alpha died instantly as the lionhound's jaws closed on her head and snapped her neck with one practiced jerk, while a slashing forepaw, razor-sharp claws fully extended, ripped the throat out of another she-wolf. By this time, the she-wolves had paused in their advance, making it marginally easier for Lhounds and Shadow to attack them from the rear, with lashing hooves and smoking blade, while Zan continued his fearsome frontal assault, seeming to flow with fluid and lethal ease from she-wolf to she-wolf, leaving only limp and bleeding forms in his wake. More than half the she-wolves were already dead or dying before they had even launched their attack in earnest, and not even one reached the terrified horses and humans cowering against the rock face. In less time than Anmar would have believed possible, the 3 surviving she-wolves fled, while Lhounds dispatched the wounded ones with his sword. It was only as the yelps of the fleeing wolves died away in the distance and silence fell that Anmar realized what an ear-numbing snarling and growling cacophony had accompanied the brief encounter. But then, shockingly, the grateful silence was shattered by the full-throated roar of the male Dale lion as Zan, standing amidst the carnage, head thrown back, massive blood-stained canines fearsomely exposed, sent his triumphant challenge echoing over the freezing wastes of the plateau. Dane was the first of the humans to speak. On a noisily exhaled breath that signaled enormous relief, he exclaimed, "By Grilland, I thought our last moments had come. There were so many of them, and I never knew that she-wolves could get that big." Anmar's appalled murmur of agreement was drowned out by Lhounds' crisp query, "Is everybody all right?" As he spoke, his eyes raked the assembled group against the rock face. By his side, Shadow was now standing motionless, in stark contrast to the other horses, that were still clearly upset and frightened, trampling around with snorting breath and rolling eyes. "Let's be on our way," he then said. "The best way to calm them down is to let them run the fear out of their systems." With that, he flowed onto Shadow's back and turned her head in the direction that their road lay. Dane and Anmar guided their horses onto the road with some difficulty. "Can you keep hold of the lead of the pack horse, Dane?" Lhounds asked as the group was assembled on the narrow track again. "Surely," Dane replied, and the horses set off at a flat run. Anmar was very conscious of the relief that coursed through the terrified Nightwind as she was able to run freely and put a lengthening distance between them and the site of the she-wolves' attack. Diagonally ahead of her, the first rays of the morning sun struck glints off Zan's tawny shape as he smoothly kept pace with the speeding horses. The rest of the day passed without further untoward incidents, allowing the shock of their encounter with the she-wolves to dissipate, though the effect of the freezing temperatures and the cutting wind seemed to be even more debilitating than usual after their traumatic encounter. So they were all teetering on the brink of utter exhaustion when they finally reached the day's way station, as predicted well after night had fallen. To their heartfelt relief, it was significantly more substantial than the previous ones they had encountered on the plain. Apart from good stables for the horses, a comfortable and well-heated dormitory and ablution facilities were provided, and as the station was staffed by a man named Oro, his wife Dee, and their sturdy son Marcus, a good meal and help with the exhausted horses was also forthcoming. The reason for the improved facilities was soon apparent. This was in fact the last way station on the Lower Plains Plateau, and as such was better equipped to provision and prepare travellers for the shorter but even more taxing crossing of the Upper Plains Plateau. The caretaker's wife spoke to them most insistently in this regard, while they were ravenously attacking their supper at the large table in the blissfully warm kitchen. The thick, savoury broth that she served them was accompanied by freshly baked, crusty barley bread, deliciously flavoured with the sweetly astringent dried fruit of the hardy ground brambles that managed to survive in sheltered spots, even at these altitudes. "You really should have a day's rest and not travel tomorrow," Dee said as she ladled more broth into Dane's bowl. "The wind is even more relentless up there on the upper plateau, and at this time of the year you will almost certainly have snow as well, and possibly even black ice." "Yes," her son confirmed, as he brought another platter of sliced bread to the table. "And we also have to fit your horses with special studded shoes to give them better purchase on the track up there. They do maintain the road fairly well, but if it snows and then freezes, the going can get treacherous." His father nodded as he placed a fragrantly steaming jug of mulled bramble wine on the table. "You will definitely also need the more heavily insulated cloaks that we can provide you with, and some snow shields to protect your eyes." Lhounds looked at the caretaker and then swiveled his glance from Anmar to Dane, and then back to Anmar again. "We could certainly all do with a day's rest," he said longingly. "We could probably push on, but I really am concerned about the horses. I have rarely seen Shadow so tired." Both Anmar and Dane nodded vehemently, before Dane said, concern very evident in his voice, "Racer is a strong, tough horse, but he was just about finished when we eventually got here." So was I, Lhounds replied, and shook his head ruefully. Even Zand was unusually subdued by the time we arrived here, and he simply never gets tired. He glanced across the room to where Zand, having finished a huge bowl of broth and bread, and then an equally big bowl of water, was lying curled up and fast asleep in the corner of the kitchen, on a rag rug in the alcove next to the stove. Despite a gentle mind nudge from Lhounds, the big animal did not even stir. This decided the matter for Lhounds. "If you are both in agreement," he said decisively to Anmar and Dane, "I think we should have a day's rest tomorrow before carrying on." This statement was met with unqualified approval, not only by Anmar and Dane, but also by the caretaker and his family, who were heartily relieved to have their good advice accepted by the exhausted travellers. And very soon afterwards, everybody gratefully retired to their beds. Lhounds left Zand undisturbed in his warm corner in the kitchen, having reassured Oro, Dee, and Marcus that they had nothing to fear from the Lhound. "In fact," Lhounds added, "you have probably never been safer in your lives than with him around." The wisdom of their decision to have a day's rest before continuing their arduous journey was emphatically borne out by the fact that none of the travellers awakened until well past noon hour the following day. Lhounds awoke first, feeling warm and better rested than he had for weeks. When he sent his usual gentle mind probe to Zand, he just received a muted impression of warmth and comfort in return. Dane and Anmar woke soon afterwards in a similar state of unaccustomed comfort and relaxation. When they were all dressed and went to attend to the horses, they found that they had already been fed and watered by Marcus and his father. It was clear that the rest time, warmly covered by thickly padded horse blankets in the comfortable stables, had greatly restored the animals as well. Soon afterwards they enjoyed another of Dee's savoury meals in the warm and homely kitchen. Zand, seeming not to have moved from the thick rug in the corner, acknowledged their presence with no more than a briefly lifted head and a sleepy glance. When Lhounds affectionately called him an idle, lazy beast, Oro was quick to point out that Zand had already been outside during the course of the morning. He was away for more than 2 hours, he said, and we were in fact starting to get concerned about him being gone so long. Zand managed to project such a smug aura of injured virtue that both Anmar and Lhounds laughed. After their late luncheon, Oro was very insistent that they had to get the travellers' extra supplies organized and get the horses reshod with their ice shoes. When they walked into the stables, he seemed a little anxious as he said, "The black might give us some problems with this. She was not friendly this morning." Anmar shook her head. "No, it won't be a problem. I always shoe her myself," and confidently proceeded to do just that when Marcus brought out the studded shoes and shoeing paraphernalia from the well-equipped stockroom. Lhounds and Dane also shoed Shadow and Racer themselves, while Oro and his son took care of their pack-horse and the extra one that they had persuaded them to take. "One pack-horse will not be able to carry all the supplies that you're going to need up there," Oro said, and Marcus confirmed his statement emphatically. Then they took the travellers into the supply room. "How are your food stocks?" Oro asked when they were standing in front of the well-filled shelves. Lhounds admitted that their supplies were starting to run very low. Oro nodded and gestured to the shelves. "We have quite a good selection here of dried foodstuffs. Our supplies are replenished every moon or 6 weeks by wagon and a train of pack horses from Gordofane. Queen Eruda herself insisted on this being done after there were quite a few deaths on the upper plateau due to exposure because people were not properly equipped for the conditions up there. They can't get any caretakers willing to live up there, so there are only some basic huts along with the bare essentials and some firewood. They used to stock the huts more comprehensively, but as the supplies invariably got stolen, they have stopped doing it. So it is up to us in the other way station like ours on the other side of the plateau to see that travellers are provided with what they will need to survive up there." While talking, Oro was busily taking packages and bags off the shelves and putting them on the sturdy bamboo table in the middle of the room. He finished with a large stack of meal cakes in fibre wrapping, and finally added a big, obviously quite heavy Hessian bag. Putting his hand on this, he said, "These are high-energy wheat, nuts, and molasses nuggets for the horses. Even if they can't get much hay up there, a handful or 2 of these per day should keep them going for the 4 days or so that the crossing will take you." He turned back to the shelf and took down a smaller linen bag. "And these are the human equivalent. Honeyed berry and nut cakes that should sustain you if you cannot stop for a proper meal." He added the bag to the pile of provisions on the table. During this time, Marcus had also been collecting items from shelves on the other side of the room. "You will each need one of these Enduro twill blankets. They feel quite light but are really very warm and almost completely waterproof." He rested his hand on another stack of woven items. These are horse blankets made from essentially the same material, just with some extra padding. You must get these onto the horses without fail the very instant you stop, he said very insistently. He then picked up a largish pile of folded garments from a bigger pile on one of the lower shelves. These are leggings, hooded undershirts, and socks made from a particularly dense interweave fabric. You will need to wear these under your clothes, or the wind up there will cut right through you. When the hoods of the undershirts are up over your heads under the hoods of your cloaks and tightened properly, they cover most of the face as well. So with the snow shields over your eyes, your faces will be well protected. He bent down again and lifted 2 more folded garments onto the table. Then both Marcus and his father frowned, and Oro said apologetically, "These are the protective cloaks that I mentioned last night, but we unfortunately have only these 2 left. We were short-supplied when we had our last delivery about 10 days ago, and then we had to give one to a man who came through here in a great hurry 2 days ago." Marcus nodded grimly and said disapprovingly, "I still think he was running away from something. He would not even consider having a day's rest, despite the fact that his poor horse certainly could have done with the respite." His father continued, "I am very worried that one of you will have to do without one of these cloaks." He sounded really concerned. Leonard shook his head and lifted a placating hand. "Really, do not distress yourself. My heavy travelling cloak has a special covering that goes over the outside when needed. It makes it very warm and completely waterproof. I will truly be fine." The caretaker and his son looked relieved. They stood studying the shelves a minute longer. Then Marcus said, "Oh yes, and how are you set for cooking utensils?" When Leonard said that he only had a smallish kettle, small pot, and 1 mug, knife, and a spoon, apart from his heavier hunting knife, and Anmar and Dane in essence indicated the same, Marcus continued as he started taking more items off the shelves. "You will then definitely need at least another 2 largish pots for cooking and heating water, and some bowls for eating and washing up in. The huts are supposed to be stocked with these things, but as I've said, due to theft, one cannot count on finding what you need up there." He turned back to the shelf and collected 3 large flattish water flagons. "You must keep these filled at all times," he said, "for even though the huts all have wells in them, it gets so cold up there that the wells have been known to freeze. Fortunately, not often, thank Greyland." When all the supplies had finally been assembled on the table, Oro said, "We have to charge you for the foodstuffs and undergarments, but with the rest you are expected to leave the rest of the supplies, blankets, cloaks, cooking utensils, and so on, along with our pack horse at the way station on the other side of the plateau. Travellers coming from that side are required to do the same here, so our stocks of non-perishables remains fairly constant." This sensible arrangement was needless to say acceptable to the 3 travellers. By this time everybody was starting to feel the chill of the unheated storeroom, so when Oro said, "We will just leave these here and get everything packed tomorrow before you leave," they were more than happy to follow him into the welcome warmth of the living quarters. The travellers were more than a little sobered by the amount of extra supplies that they needed. It was clear that the way station existed for a very good reason. They were also starting to be uncomfortably aware that the Upper Plains Plateau would almost certainly present a bigger challenge than they had anticipated.